Hey, and welcome to the next episode of The Prestige, a podcast about films and filmmaking and film theory.
Each week we'll be looking at a particular film and then a general theme circulating around that film and giving us a chance to talk about other ideas.
So we'll kick it off with some sort of reviewing discussion of the film itself, go on to our losers and end it off with some recommendations and that kind of thing. But for all of that, who are we?
My name's Sam, and I'm a writer and teacher, and I write about books and graphic novels.
My name's Rob, and I'm a film colourist with about a decade's experience working on major films around the UK. So this week, kicked off by last week's discussion, we looked at Reservoir Dogs. Your thoughts, Sam?
I love this film. they're the only thoughts I've got. There's a 15-second podcast for you. No, I think this is brilliant, and it's hard to get your head around how this was a director in his 20s, and it was the first thing he did. Well, I suppose it's not. It was the first major film he did.
Given this is it's on the surface level a very violent film about some robbers, about some not people, why love it so much?
Okay, right. Because it's not about robbers, and it's not about violence, and it's not about torture, and it's not about blood. And I had this idea about Tarantino that his films, and particularly this one's a particularly good example, are so good because they're so self-referential, and they're just aware all the time of what it is to make a film. And Reservoir Dogs even starts with Tarantino himself saying, "What was I talking about?" So from the very beginning of this film, you've got him calling attention to the fact that actually this is just a narrative that he's throwing at you. And then you have, all the things about Tim Roth with performance being important and his role being that of an actor, although he's not an actor, he's an undercover cop, but then he's an actor playing an undercover cop who has to play an actor in those scenes. So I like the way it's just such a clever film, and this is one of the things I love about Tarantino, and particularly his early work, but also some of the later stuff and some of the things he did in Django Unchained and Inglourious Basterds. With just the awareness that he has is brilliant.
Yeah, for me, I would agree with everything that you said there. For me, the thing that I loved about this was that it broke down in a very sort of popularist way established codes of cinema. So I'm totally down with the whole "it's a film, the film" kind of thing. But for me, it opens with a long discussion about A, tipping, and B, the meaning of "Like a Virgin" by Madonna. That's the opening scene of what has been sold to the audience as a crime film.
Yeah.
And I think you can trace the root to this kind of stuff back to things like Slacker by Richard Linklater. Have you seen that, Sam?
No.
Slacker is 1991, so it's a year before Reservoir Dogs, and it's basically you meet a guy on a street, you follow him for sort of 10 seconds, and he meets someone else, and you don't get like a narrative. If you've seen the opening to The Player, where you drop all these people over like an epic one take, it's that, but in a film. And that was very much the birth of the American indie movement in a popularist way. And I think that Reservoir Dogs carries on that. And I think that Tarantino's made a career out of doing this kind of stuff, where yes, they're cops, and yes, they're robbers, and yes, they're criminals. But when you've been raised in the kind of the archetypes of things like Godfather and Casino, where things like movies and books and TV and things don't exist in film world.
Yeah.
There's a fan theory of things like Walking Dead. The Walking Dead exists in a world where zombies never happened. Because film reality, I make with air quotes, is a different reality to us. Things like books don't exist, films don't exist. In a zombie film, it became laughable that none of the characters knew what a zombie was.
And everyone knows how to kill a zombie,
exactly.
Except in a zombie film.
And I think this kind of the indie movement, and Reservoir Dogs was a big icon of that, broke those rules down. And when you actually know, our characters have listened to Madonna songs, they have seen films, they have musical tastes that are completely unimportant to their character roles, but are interesting and something to talk about. In the same way, if God forbid, me and my friends had to go and commit a robbery, we would, when we were hanging out, chat about TV shows and films that we've watched.
Yes.
And I think it broke down those existing codes of film world, of almost the proscenium arch of cinema happening beyond that and it isn't fourth wall breaking in the way other things are, but I think it bleeds the two worlds of performance world and the real world down.
Yeah.
And to keep back to zombie seconds, the reason why people love Shaun of the Dead so much,
exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking about Simon Pegg as is similar.
Exactly, and that one's very, you watch that because we're all well aware that if zombies happened, it would be much like Shaun of the Dead. We were all a bit like, oh shit, all right. We aren't action heroes. I think that's when you infuse your film with pop culture references. That helps. I think also there's a very smart thing in Reservoir Dogs from a filmic point of view. The pop culture references aren't current references.
Yeah.
So they aren't talking, and then that's downfall of some films. They talk about Twitter or MySpace, all that sort of stuff. They're talking about 70s culture.
Yeah.
And that way, it, despite being pop culture reference filmed, doesn't date itself.
Yes, I was thinking actually also how it feels like quite a retro film. The way it's shot is very. I mean, it doesn't feel like a film made in the early 90s, which is a good thing given what else was being made in the early 90s.
Yes,
but there is that sort of 70s sensibility to the way it was made, and it was something that we've talked about before with what was that early film you worked on that used film stuff?
Away Days.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, just for the listener out there, I worked on a film called Away Days. I didn't mention it on a previous podcast, but we were very much going for a 70s look, and that was a modern film set in the 70s. But I know what you mean. I think that, it's obviously look at Tarantino's filmography, that he has a love of that old cinema. A lot of his later films, especially something like Jackie Brown, but more so in other genres as well, he's harking back to those old films he loves. Westerns, war movies, especially World War II movies. And for the period when he's been making these films, these genres haven't been big. Like we are very much post the Western era of cinema, and very much post the World War II movie era of cinema. But he still makes those films in those genres for a modern audience.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think there's certainly, I think Tarantino himself will happy that he has a love of that kind of era of cinema.
I also, going back to that first scene, I was thinking when you talked about The Godfather and Casino and things like that, it struck me that it's such a clever scene because you could have a character in that saying, "You talking to me?" Or no, not Taxi Driver, but so you think I'm funny? You think I'm funny? How? And the other character in that scene would say, "Well, yes, I do think you're funny, and here's why you're being an idiot."
Yes,
rather stronger language, but it's not. There's something about films like Casino and The Godfather that take themselves very seriously in a way that Tarantino films definitely don't.
I think there's one notable thing from Reservoir Dogs is almost the lack of a hero.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got Tim Roth, who I suppose at a certain point is the hero because he's the cop, but he's certainly not a hero. At no point is he portrayed as the hero character. I mean, if anything, you've got Mr. White at Harvey Hotel, who has the kind of the arc of the story, but even he's clearly a bad guy, and it's very unusual in that no one there, even other crime films, things like even Ocean's 11 or Godfather, you have got a hero character to it, and this doesn't have that. There's no one who we're looking to identify with. It's something to see.
There's a moment. There's a fairly short scene with Mr. Orange right before Tim Roth joins the guys on for the heist. And he looks around his apartment and he searches for the ring that he's wearing as a wedding ring. And that is about as close as you get to empathising with the character. But I agree, you're right, he's not a good guy at all.
But I think that's interesting, and in the way that you've got something like Kill Bill, which is a later film, Tarantino, which has a hero character, certainly, but she clearly isn't a hero. She's a mass murdering ex-assassin. But she's very much portrayed in the film as the hero, the one we follow, and that is quite evidently missing in this. I think Pulp Fiction has that as well. There isn't really a hero to those films.
No, there isn't, and there isn't even a central narrative in Pulp Fiction.
No. But I think both of those kind of do echo one of Tarantino's certain trademarks, is the mixing of time.
Yes.
Both those films play with the traditional linear story. Pulp Fiction is a great example of the different stories, different time frames. But Reservoir Dogs uses it as a great technique because you see the flashbacks, and it's notable that for a well-loved heist film, you never ever see the heist.
Also, something really good about the flashbacks is there's no clunky 2 hours earlier or 17 minutes later. It's just Tarantino assumes that you know what's going on. So he gives his audience credit for being able to follow a storyline like that.
And I think that sometimes when in his career he has misstepped a little bit, it has been because of that, where he loses that faith in the audience to go with him.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, he as anyone know, the pop culture mythology around Tarantino is he worked in a video store for many years and has seen more films than any man ever. And that's why his films are so full of these references, is because he spent all these years watching all these films. And so when he first started out, you know when it's a flashback. You don't need to tell you it's 2 years ago, 10 hours ago. You know it is. And he came at it with that kind of, I've watched thousands of films this last year. And I think that over time, if you look at his sort of career, that hasn't lasted. Obviously, he hasn't watched as many films as he used to. But I think that this early stuff very much brought into the language of cinema, the unspoken language of cinema, that we all kind of understand how film, even in certain non-linear, like Reservoir Dogs, we all understand how these things work, and he uses that to great effect, I think.
Yeah.
But let's go back to your discussion earlier about sort of the more theory side of things, of it being a film about filming.
Well, I was thinking more generally about the way that certain films call attention to their own existence. There was one, actually, there was a serendipitous moment right at the beginning of this podcast where you got the name of the film wrong, and you said Clerks by mistake. Because I've got that written down as one of my recommendations for this week, because it's the same sort of film. It's the same idea of nothing really happens, but something monumental has happened.
Yes.
We're going to spend the whole film sort of calling attention to the existence of a film, and also exploring the relationship between these characters. So I was going to give Clerks, or Clerks, depending on your American or English. I was going to give that as a recommendation for this week. So I'm glad you sort of inadvertently said it.
Well, I think Clerks is an interesting one. I'll certainly like to cover that in a later podcast, because Clerks and its sequel, Mallrats, are one of the reasons why I make films. I saw those as an impressionable teenager and went on to follow a career in film because of seeing these films. But that's another podcast, I think. I think you make a great point there. I think that Tarantino's love of cinema and cinematic tricks is very evident. I think if you look, even later films like Kill Bill, he uses tricks like switching to black and white and back to colour, which are clearly breaking the sort of the proscenium arch nature of film, but to great effect, and take you with him on them. And obviously that one mixes with time as well, as you jump back and forth between different things. And there are various shots in that are clearly filmic.
Yeah.
Including obviously her talking direct to camera. But I think that he does great work in using the language of cinema to its own effect. And
there are some particularly clever bits. I don't especially want to talk about the torture scene and Stuck in the Middle with You, because that's the only thing anyone seems to talk about that film. But when Michael Madsen leaves the warehouse to get something from his car, there is a very, very clever bit of shooting that's done in one take, and that's just amazing. And it's like, I can say this because I've only seen the first half an hour of it, so ready for my Philistine status to be exposed. But from the very beginning of Citizen Kane, there is a camera shot, and that is amazing. And when you know about how difficult it was to do, you think Orson Welles was a genius at what he did.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry for not seeing the rest of it.
It's all right. I think this is a thing I look coming down the line, but Citizen Kane is one of those films that's important and relevant, but may not be good.
Right. Okay.
I think, and it's one of those films that, like, we understand why it's important in the history of film, but if you sit and watch it today, it isn't going to rock your world.
Right. Okay.
You know, in the same way that, like, The Jazz Singer.
Yes.
It's important to film as a whole, but you watch it now and you're like, well, yeah, it's alright. It's nothing special unless you know its history. It comes with baggage compared to the filmic text itself.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of that around Reservoir Dogs as well, just to kind of tie together that Reservoir Dogs obviously was the calling card of Tarantino, who has become a force, and Tarantino-esque is a filmic style all of itself. So there is a lot. Like Reservoir Dogs, it's hard to discuss Reservoir Dogs without its history. And in fairness, I opened this podcast, my first thoughts were about its history, its place in history, rather than the text itself.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes it can be hard to separate those two. But I do think you're right. I think about Tarantino and his love of cinema as a tool as well as just a medium. All throughout his career, I mean, like Death Proof, which I don't think was as good as he wanted it to be.
I think Death Proof is the only Tarantino I haven't seen.
It's good in that it could have been far worse, but it suffers from being paired against Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror.
Oh yeah, because it was was that the one that was a dual feature?
Yes, it was a Grindhouse double bill called Grindhouse, and Death Proof is much more a 70s kind of duel-esque horror film. It's about the niceness of man and building that tension up, whereas Planet Terror is a balls-out 80s VHS slasher film kind of thing. And I think when you compare the two in a double bill, it comes off worse, but it has got a lot of good things. But the main character is a film stuntman.
Right.
Inglourious Bastards, to spoil a little bit, the big fight is in a cinema.
Yes.
There's a lot about cinema as a whole in the films, and he uses the language of that to do interesting things, as you say, single takes, that kind of thing. There's a technical skill to his filmmaking that I think can often be overshadowed by his use of pop culture and language.
Something else I noticed a couple of times is the way that he will do something that's sort of a nod to film convention, and then it'll appear to be Tarantino thumbing his nose at the audience because, well, there's a bit where Michael Madsen, at the beginning of the torture scene, primes his gun and then puts that down, and you think that might be used later on, and then it turns out it isn't used at all. And then there's Tim Roth in the diner, and there's a shot of him meeting his buddy outside, and you think, oh, this is a sign there's a watcher looking on, but actually it's not at all. He's just using an establishing shot from outside the building. So there'll be times like that where Tarantino just says, well, you may think there's something going on here, but this is just real life.
I think it's always the rejection. I think it's a Chekhov quote that if you put a gun on the mantelpiece in scene 1, it has to be shot in scene 3.
That's what I was thinking. That Tarantino rejects this idea.
Well, I think that all links back to, as we were saying earlier, about even the pop culture, like the opening scene, bears no real relation to the rest of the film. The fact that Mr. Pink doesn't tip, which is a good 5-minute part of the opening scene, doesn't matter.
No.
That doesn't come in. I mean, there is argument around the fact that it's Mr. Orange that grasses him up to Joe, is sort of a foreshadowing of his nature as the.
Yeah.
I think, but
bit tenuous.
I think that is a bit of a reach, and I think that's, as you say, it is the rejection of that of the Chekhov idea is that people can just talk about things, and it doesn't relate to the story. It doesn't relate to the overarching plot. Nothing is foreshadowed. It's just them talking. And the gun with Mr. Blonde is a great example of that. I think I'm quickly looking at Tarantino here to look at his wider collection. Jackie Brown is the only one I think really didn't work.
Because I was looking at some clips online earlier this evening, and I came across one bit from Jackie Brown which was brilliant, and it was perfect Tarantino, and it's the scene where Robert De Niro's just had enough and flips and shoots Bridget Fonda, and that struck me as a, and I can see what you're saying. The film as a whole may not work, but that struck me as a particularly Tarantino-esque moment.
I would agree. I think it's full of little moments like that are Tarantino styling. And I do have a theory around why I don't think it's reached the same level of popular support that other films have. And I think it's around he almost went too far down the rabbit hole. Reservoir Dogs and True Romance were kind of, and Pulp Fiction were kind of taking the genres of crime and twisting them. Kill Bill is the classic revenge film. Inglourious Basterds is a war film. Django Unchained is a hit western. Jackie Brown is a modern day retelling of a blaxploitation classic. Now,
and there'll be times in Django, for example, where he nods towards blaxploitation, but you're right, it is solely that.
And I mean, I have a large collection of weird alternate films, and I've seen a lot of that kind of the era, but it's not as well known a genre as everything else he's done. The blaxploitation genre, people may have seen one, maybe two films, but to put you on a spot, Sam, I mean, apart from Shaft,
yeah, and I'm out.
Exactly, and there's a infamous Jackie Brown one called Coffee, which people often reach to, but beyond that, people don't know much about that genre, and I think that's the reason why it isn't as loved, is because people don't get all the references that he puts in there.
Yes,
even if it's subliminal, and I do think that's Jackie Brown was not misstepped, because I think it's a great film, but I do think that it lost a lot of the audience because they just didn't know where he was going with it.
And that's one of the great things about Tarantino, is that you can not know where he's going and it still be enjoyable because it's familiar.
Yes.
Whereas if it's not, then you're completely lost. As at times in Jackie Brown, then you lose a bit of that.
Yeah, I think that's he trades, his stock in trade is our shared cultural knowledge, and we all get the opening scene of Reservoir Dogs because we know the song like a virgin.
Yes.
We get a lot of things, whereas with blaxploitation, we just didn't know the references he was making, and he lost us.
No.
Well, I mean that's a good place to end the list. Sam, you got anything else you want to add particularly to this, or we can move on to our recommendations?
Well, you've already stolen one of my recommendations.
Fair enough.
But I suppose anything by Kevin Smith would be a good option to pair with Tarantino. And also thinking about this idea of self-referential cinema and playing with narrative, I was thinking about it's another 90s film. It's the original, the Dîner de Con. And when I say the original, I mean the French one, because there was an awful US remake called Dinner with Schmucks, which turned it into a horrible knockabout buddy comedy, and it's not that at all. The original French one is brilliant. So that would be my recommendation for this.
I genuinely don't think I've seen that, so I shall have to check that one out.
That's possibly the first time that's happened.
Yes, yeah. I'm going to echo Sam a little bit here, and have to talk about Kevin Smith. And I think I recommend watching Clerks and Clerks 2, because we were talking about earlier about classicness of references. I think Clerks 2 doesn't get it right. Clerks 2 talks a lot about the upcoming Lord of the Rings films and all this sort of stuff, and it dates itself quite badly, whereas Clerks doesn't, because it talks about things like Star Wars and Jaws and more classic references. I think you're looking at that kind of, you're looking into how to do pop culture stuff in maybe a film you're making or watching, how it can be done well or badly. I would look at the compare and contrast of those two films, because there's interesting parallels and differences around them. And I'm going to almost recommend a film prior to Reservoir Dogs called City on Fire. City on Fire is a 1987 film by Chow Yun-fat from Hong Kong. And Reservoir Dogs basically is the American remake of this film.
Right, in terms of the narrative?
In terms of the narrative, it's very much, it's a Tarantino take on it, and it's not a remake, but if you're looking at influences and if you're liking the kind of the styling of the film and the narrative play, this is a place to look at it. And also, as we're talking about referential stuff and self-referential stuff, the homage that Reservoir Dogs is to City on Fire is a great place to look. But it's well worth. Well, it's a good film in itself, obviously, but it is. There are certain links in the films to check out.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for that, Rob. And as you said, it's probably a good place to stop for this week. And if you have any suggestions for what we might like to cover in the coming weeks, then please do get in touch.
You can find us on Twitter as Prestige Podcast. Drop us a tweet with your thoughts on what we've talked about today and anything else you want us to talk about in future. All right, guys. See you next week.
See you next week. Thanks for listening. Thank you.